I'll remember.
So remember, we're gonna ask about online 3 p.m. starting not this week, but next.
Okay, so Deb, don't let us forget that next week, we're looking at Thursday, and the Thursday it's harder to be able to do what we're doing on Thursday, both online and in person at the same time. And so we're thinking about doing online separate from in person. And so we just need to know from online people if that works better for them or not. Okay, and would you come online at 3 o'clock and then in person at 4 o'clock? So, okay, so think about that. But you've been coming here live, so maybe you're not a good one to ask.
I think Diane Wilson might be someone we could reach out
We
to.
could,
And
we
if you
could.
think of anybody else who might benefit from the online, but more interactive online on Thursday, I would do that at 3 o'clock. So just let me know and I can send out an email, probably not till Friday this time.
Okay. All right. Ollie says yes. I'll set it up tomorrow. I want to start with a quote from the very last part of this chapter. John Scotus Eriugena, which his name literally means Scotus, which is Scot, Eriugena, Irish. So he's flaunting very strongly his roots and saying, I am not all the other things, all right? And the title is Sacred Flow. And I just love this part of it. If we are to see a true reawakening to the sacredness of the earth and harness the deepest energies of our being to serve this awareness, we need a stronger inner authority in our own souls to challenge the religious, political, and social systems that have recklessly ignored or denied this sacredness and are imperiling the very future of the world. He is saying that what is deepest within us should be what guides us, right? But why is it that we don't trust that? Because we've all seen people misuse that. Say, I'm speaking for God, but, right? But isn't that what we're doing when we say only the church speaks for God as well? Which is what obviously the Catholic Church at that time was doing to John Scotus. How do we find that space where we trust each other and are worthy of trust from each other is the big issue. How do we trust that depth of? How do we get to that space? That's what I think he was trying to deal with. But again and again, we go back to what this story was about. And he comes to church and says, let me tell you the right way to think. What hit you in this chapter? What was important to you?
Kept trying to condemn him, it went on for too long as far as I was concerned. And didn't work. I mean, they kept trying to say, no, you can't do this, or your book's set up, it didn't work. So at least someone maybe saw through or realized what books and what knowledge he had was the truth. But they just kept trying to knock him down, do everything to belittle him and everything that he wrote about and all that, but it didn't work. That's why was the correlation in some of the others what we're reading. How many others they keep knocking down? The establishment is what I have to call them.
Yeah.
Kept trying to belittle them and do everything to them, and they stood up.
Yeah. I wish I could say this is going to be the last time we're going to see that dynamic in the book. It is not going to be.
Every single.
Yep, it's a story that's repeated again and again,
every
and
single-
not just towards Celtic thought, but again and again across the spectrum in the Christian world.
It's all
There's
this,
this thing
it's
up
all
here's
this
all the
man-made
truth.
stuff.
Yeah.
Man's word was the only one they went by because women weren't worthy. You weren't heard or seen or done. You were put on earth to do one thing. That was your sole purpose in life.
Which, by the way, was my favorite part of this whole book, where Augustine of Canterbury wrote to the Pope and said, what do we do about these women that are enjoying sex?
Yeah.
Right, that was essentially the question, is, you know, okay, you can have sex, but only for procreation. If you start to enjoy it, then.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't think anybody was supposed to do it.
Right, nobody's supposed to enjoy it, is right.
Just the women.
My favorite, the thing that struck me, I read it again this afternoon before I came, and it's almost like a paraphrase of what you just read on the page before. Said part of what Eugenia's wisdom can foster in us for today is a strong sense of inner authority. That's what I want to ask about. In a time of immense outward transition and change. I mean, that's like it's today.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Mhm.
I mean, in like inner authority, what do you think of that? What is inner authority? Is it just like what you said, just like trusting what we really believe?
Yeah, it's two different things. It's much simpler sometimes to set your authority somewhere else,
Yeah.
but I think that's sort of have to take responsibility. Well, the Bible said it's not my thing, it's the Bible, you know, or it's the president, or it's the whatever. I think God works in us in a way that should be. I have this voice which draws, and the problem is that how many have sometimes followed a voice within you that didn't quite lead you to perfect thing? Because we don't hear that inner voice perfectly. It takes some time to understand and follow that. And we especially see it sometimes in each other. We see sometimes how much other people from our point of view seem to fail, seem to damage the world or themselves. And so that seems to be a way that we give ourselves permission to not have to trust the inner authority, at least in them. And so it's a thing that we have to learn into, not just individually, but also corporately. We have to figure out how to grow into into hearing that voice and following that voice and becoming that voice in the world.
That's what Buddhism is too.
Yes,
I mean, you know, if you read a lot of Buddhism, that's what it's about.
that's exactly right. And the hard part is that that's not a very good authority for some of my Christian friends, because, well, that's somebody else. That's not real. That's not where God really spoke. Right? And so this in some ways sounds too much like that non-Christian space. And yet I go back to this. Celtic thought is a very deep and old strand of Christianity. It's not like it's a brand new wave thing. It's not like it's because Buddhism came out this way that then Christianity followed. This is all in a grand scheme of who we've been for a long time. And you can't write it off as easy as what sometimes we want to do.
I was struck, this kind of relates to what Harlow was saying, is that it struck me in this chapter particularly that he's talking about inner authority and sacred flow, and he describes that, but almost sideways. So tomorrow, just to plug in tomorrow, we're going to break down inner authority and sacred flow as much as I can stay within the Celtic, but there'll probably be some mindfulness into this, I have to say that. But, and other Christian, like if you look at inner authority from the Wesleyan quadrilateral, this is a really good personal way to, so we'll talk a little bit about that. But it just was interesting because they use the sacred flow, especially like, what exactly is that? Like, I know that in relationship to art and my creative process, it's a hard one. You know, he comes at it through nature, right? He talks a lot about nature, but what do you think?
Let me ask you a question first of all. Does everyone know what she means by Wesleyan quadrilateral?
No,
Oh, sorry.
Wesleyan quadrilateral is a thought that kind of comes from John Wesley's stuff that was formulated much later by Albert Outler, and it said that there's 4 sides to a quadrilateral by which we figure out how to do things. 2 of those are scripture and tradition. What has been done in the church and what does the biblical record tell us? The other 2 are experience, not my experience, but my spiritual experience, right? How has God moved in me? And the other is reason. How is my mind working? And so you see how two of these are outward authorities and two of these are inward authorities that work together to help us discern what is the voice of God in all of this. And we rightfully sometimes move towards one or the other, and it's those four that he said we should use to be able to move forward. So, having said that, let's go back to, does that help to understand the quadrilateral?
I really,
Yeah.
So are you saying we move forward as like the church community or as individuals?
Both. The hard part is that we have to figure out how to move in both those circles. I don't believe that most of the spiritual works that I read are about how Jim gets more spiritual, but about how we become more the kingdom of God from the biblical account, or more the people that are following, more the community of love. However you phrase it, is how do I become better in this that's around me? And part of that is because I get stronger in my own self, but I look at Thich Nhat Hanh, he wasn't just strengthening his own individual self, he was also building that community that allowed them to do something different than just an individual. So it's both, if that makes sense.
You can extrapolate that and say, I was just reading something, or not getting into anything political, but they said that's why we were really resonating with Bernie Sanders, because it wasn't about him, it was about how to make this country better.
Yeah, I mean, Bernie
So that's
Sanders.
what brought it up.
Bernie Sanders is one of the most non-egotistical politicians that I know. Not that he doesn't have an ego, but remarkably lower in ego than what a lot of folks in that line of work have.
Who else would have sat with the mittens and the hat and
Celebrated that. Yeah,
Yeah, right, he did what he wanted to do. Mhm.
You see Hillary Clinton. Not a lot of people. I don't know, not zeroing that on her.
There were also monks who did them on mass, well, not monks, no. People who did the monastic thing where they did more in solitude.
absolutely. It's not that solitude is unimportant. There's always been some solitude that's happened through. That's been not unimportant. And I think that's a good spiritual discipline for what we all should go to sometimes. I don't believe it's meant to be a continual way of life. I don't think solitude is our best space. That makes sense.
So I think it's best in community then.
I-
That's what, which is why.
Yeah, I think well, it could be that, but it could be all kinds of, that's why we have families, that's why we have schools. We learn and grow from each other, and the solitude can help. But I think we should do some of that, but my interpretation of a particular scripture might be strongly enhanced by your take on that very same passage. Right? My way of saying this is how prayer works might be enlarged by how you think prayer works or changed. Did I hear someone wanted to say something over here?
maybe Joyce.
She's not there anymore.
But she's coming back.
That's different what she thinks.
It's always hard because, just some of us gravitate towards this, towards the solitude more. Some of us gravitate towards the communal more. And neither one of them is wrong, but I think they're enhanced by each other. Neither one speaks the whole of it. My wife is, if you've ever taken the Myers-Briggs test, here's the thing about my wife and I. We're like this. And then we switch and we're like this. And then we're like this. We're far apart on 3 of the 4 scales. And yet she enhances my life on a regular basis. And occasionally I enhance hers. Because who I am and who she is can complement and help each other to become more than what we are alone. And so solitude or individual growth is important, right? But it's not the end all of the spiritual life. The spiritual life is not meant just for my betterment, but for how I live in the world.
And what I find for myself is that when I've learned something new or intuited something new, it's not real until I've shared it, until I've put words to it.
Mm.
So in that sense, I need audience. And that comes from community.
Yeah.
To be able to express, you know, what it is that I've been working on or not working on, and it just came to me.
Yeah. And wouldn't that imply then that the other people around you also need audience too? And so you need to be both a voice and a set of ears.
During this pandemic, I don't know if you looked at any of the stats, but the number of suicides in the 20, 30-year-olds and some early 40s is astronomical.
Yeah.
And it's proven one thing to me. It's like you said, I've been the worst pregnancy of my life. And that's why I think we have to come back together, you know, and be together, because the human body needs contact.
Yeah.
You know, and I was just like, so when I was reading those stats the other day, it's astounding, you know. I've got too much in life to do yet. But I wouldn't even think about suicide, but these kids think that's the only answer for them.
Sure. But I would think that's a couple of different things. First of all, it's because of the distance. And there is that need you outlined to have each other. I think sometimes it's because we have not done the work that you talked about. We don't know how to, as this quote says, each one of us has access to the well of wisdom. We haven't taught each other sometimes how to access that well of wisdom.
Mhm.
So if you're sitting there by yourself, hidden away from everything else, every other way that you could find a meaning and purpose, and you don't know how to tap into that, suddenly you are alone in a way that you have never been before. And it's not the absence of people, it's the absence of that meaning and purpose.
I think too, if you're a person who's inclined towards solitude, because I know I really enjoy solitude sometimes, but it also helps to come back into community to test those ideas that you're getting in solitude. Because after you begin to voice them and run them past somebody, sometimes, you know, they're just nuts. And sometimes they're, you know, they're really, really good, but I think you need the community to be able to bounce things off of, to know what you want to keep and what you don't, and where you want to go, you know, which direction you want to go to and maybe not. And so being out there, the lone person in the cottage in the woods all the time by yourself, I don't think is mentally healthy. And I'm not sure how much spiritual growth you could actually do doing that.
Well, I think you can do a lot of spiritual growth there, but I think that you have to be really careful. You know, if we're talking about flow, you have to ask yourself, is this a flow of wisdom, or is it a flow from somewhere lower down on the anatomy?
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Because it can be just that also. It can be something that is lesser in importance, and sometimes by bringing it to other people, we can more closely analyze it. The hard part is that, as the larger group often does, sometimes we try to control each other's flow of wisdom. And so we sit, just like happened with us, oh no, that's not right. You have to trust. And that's where we do it wrong. But it sure feels good to keep people saying something that we're used to and that sounds like what we've already said. Right? It's easy to do that, isn't it?
Well, I've told you before, Zoom has helped me connect a lot with this church through soul connection and different things too of this, in ways I haven't been able to for a long time. And part of that too is sharing books that you've read, things that you're like, and you know, just getting different ideas from different people on things. They're tangents they're going off on. And I liked it too in here where they talked about all the people who weren't in clergy, who worked outside the clergy.
Yeah.
The Peregrini,
Yeah.
and other people, you know, who was like, the Vatican couldn't control, you know, they couldn't
Yeah.
really control it. And I thought that was, that was pretty cool.
Yeah, but that's because the church in those 200 years that they weren't controlling the Celts, we're also figuring out this theology that had begun with the first Augustine. This thing of saying you're evil from the beginning of time, right? You have this original sin right there. And they were perfecting much of that. And they had put down the rules of religion, right? And how it works. And suddenly these Celts who had developed a whole different way of viewing were saying, yeah, you don't need that. And it's kind of tough when you talk to someone else and they look at you and say, yeah, I don't need that.
One of the reasons I really enjoyed this and enjoyed the book is it's going back to the year 300. And so many of us, I mean, we look at life in like chunks of like over the 50s, like the 40s, like the 30s, like, and we're talking like what you just said, something that was in power for 200 years. And that's, you know, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah. And just the fact that for 200 years they thought about that and developed a practice should have made it so that the rest of the church came in and said, let us see what we can learn from it. And yet, so often that's not the way we approach it. Instead, we look at it and see, oh, you're so different from me, you can't be right. What if there's wisdom there that we haven't, that our own flow of spirit hasn't revealed for whatever reason?
Can I ask one other question?
You can ask 3 other questions.
Okay, all right, but this is the only one I have.
Okay.
I'll finish this book, all that I've been reading, I'm almost done with the whole book, but I've noticed they talk about the Roman Church. And so is that like a euphemism for the Catholic Church? Or is when did that church become the Catholic Church? And I know the 30 Years' War when everything separated, but it just seems like when you read through all of it, it's always the.
I think it's more nefarious than that.
You do.
I think he is saying the church that is bought into the Roman Empire.
All right.
The church that is not just a religious organization, a spiritual organization any longer, but also a political power organization.
Right. I was in Germany once in a small town near Regensburg, little bitty burg, and it was my pen friend. We went to visit people out in Reichenbach, and his wife took me to her church where she grew up, and it was the most Catholic. This is Bavaria, it's a very Catholic part of Germany. And the church, I just was like, my jaw dropped. I mean, there were angels, like little cherubs, there were naked butts everywhere, and gold, and they had the gold behind a fence so nobody would steal it, and all this stuff. And it was so funny. I said to my partner, I said, look at all of this. Why, like I said something like, why would anybody want to leave this? And he said, that's the reason why they left, because the church was so powerful.
Yeah.
And that stunned me.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sitting there enjoying all this like gold plating, naked butts, and then all of a sudden it's like, this is why they had all the money, they had all the power.
But isn't that a great metaphor for why oftentimes we don't believe what's there, because whatever is there of power and influence and gold and all this stuff that is appealing to us, that keeps us in a space. It doesn't mean it's the right space or it's the holy space. And are we able to listen well enough to see beyond just the opulence or the strength, even the comfort that space gives to us?
It feels like a winning side,
It feels like the winning side. That's right.
and everybody wants to
And
be
that's
the winning
exactly.
side.
Yeah, that's where everybody wants to identify.
But especially also if you've been in that church and your generations before you have been in that church and you've seen some of the good that church has done, you've felt some of the strength of what that community has been. There's some reasons why going and finding another path beyond just that feels anti-religious, anti-spiritual, anti-God, right? Because there are good things that have happened there. But is it defining, ultimately, is it defining the path you should go on? And at least part of this idea of flow is that spirit is going to flow through you and towards your path, not just to the path that has been. that it's an active thing, not a past thing. One of the interesting things about my conservative friends right now is that they do a whole bunch of old time religion type of theology. It used to be, it ought to still be. Well, I just don't believe that. I believe at least part of each generation's job is to overthrow part of what the old generation had. Maybe not the whole thing, but to draw us somewhere further down that road. That's what, that to me is what the flow of spirit is supposed to do.
Maybe they're not looking at it the same way you are.
They might not be.
So therefore, there's a chasm
Yeah,
that you're both looking at it from a different perspective.
yes, yeah. That's the hard part. And I, having made a switch like that, I have to look back at my family, my loved ones that are sitting in the space that I left. And I have to say, are they still encountering God? Are they still being moved by God in some way or another? My answer has to be yes. Maybe not in the way that would help me, but does that mean it's not part of the flow of?
And that's a tough thing because we can never know all of the things that are going on inside of a person. You know what I mean? You're looking at people and you're thinking, gosh, it doesn't look like God is moving, but you have no idea what's going through their mind, what's going through their day to day, where God is actually moving in a way you just can't see.
And it gets even harder, Deb, when, like if we think of flow, we often think river,
Yeah.
where it's all flowing in this direction. But it's more like wind, where it kind of swirls sometimes. And sometimes it looks like you're being led by spirit this way when I'm going exactly the opposite way. And can that be true? And we want to say no, because obviously I'm being moved by spirit, I'm going this way, so you got to be moving the same way as me. But is that always the answer?
That's the end of the flow.
Yeah, yeah. And can we trust that? And it's hard to, because if this is, if I've been given some answer in my search, it's real easy to say that this is the answer for everybody. Maybe it's not. And can we have the humility of spirit to accept our truth, but not force our truth? And the answer too often is no.
We'd like to think that a lot of this stuff is all ancient, but we pick up the New York Times today, the guy that fought the government in Myanmar was hung. Stuff is happening this week. You go against the government, go against who's the power strong enough.
Yeah. Yeah. And which brings us to one of the topics that we talk about in here, and that's that issue of sin. What is that where we do damage to each other, where we hurt society and hurt ourselves? And I loved what they said here. These actions, talking about sin, are not viewed as human nature, which is what original sin was talking about. That is part of your human nature, that you are broken and that you do things wrong. But it's part of a betrayal of our nature. A denial of what is deepest within us, the sacred essence of the divine. So we're not trying to find something different than what we are. We're trying to find the deepest part of what we are. And then too often we sit in the surface areas instead of going into those deeper, more true spaces.
I like the phrase he uses, soul forgetfulness.
Soul forgetfulness, that was a great
That was
good phrase,
really-
wasn't it?
That just like, I had to sit and just.
Yeah.
Meditate
Yeah.
on that for a while.
Leprosy of the soul wasn't bad.
That wasn't bad either, was it?
Yeah.
Which one was that?
Leprosy.
Leprosy of
Oh,
the
yeah,
soul.
yeah, yes.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, now the hard part about this is that about 400 years before this happened, they'd already eradicated this in some ways, because one of the strongest things that the Council of Nicene had done was to say, let's get rid of things like the Gnostics. And the Gnostics had this thing about forgetfulness, about sleeping. And one of my favorite tales is about a boy from a prince who goes down into Egypt wearing, he has a fine robe, but he takes off the robe as he leaves. but that makes it so he forgets who he is. He's going down there to beat the dragon, and he forgets who he is. And essentially, at the end of the tale, he remembers. There's his father, the king, sends a message, and he remembers who he is. And I think at least part of that depth of soul is that which is calling us to remember our deepest things. Who are we really? The hard part about that is it means that the church doesn't get to define depth. Right? That you have to find it yourself. And so it takes that out of the control of the corporate. And corporate never likes being out of control.
So we're not controlling them being corporate?
To some degree,
Yeah.
yeah.
Nice.
And again, I go back to, I'm not saying corporate is wrong. I think corporate just exerts things in ways that are not always the best for every individual. They're just what's simpler for the corporate.
Yeah, it's what's best for the corporation and not necessarily what's best for the individuals in it.
Sure, because it's much simpler, for example, to teach a classroom full of kids if they all do the same thing at the same time and you have control as a teacher. As soon as you, as soon as you start letting them do other things, it quickly gets chaotic in a room.
It depends on what school though, because there's a lot of schools around that have that free flow. Where
Right.
kids do extremely well where they're not controlled.
That's right. We are learning more and more that that is a truth, but we've had to really go against some of the teacher training that was out there to be able to figure that out. Right?
So I think in some strange way, that's where we're at here at St. Francis. And not that we weren't doing that before, not that we weren't striving to allow lots of different versions of the sacred and the holy. But I think we're again finding ourselves at that crossroad is how do we even step into that further? And it is, I think, as I don't know, Jeff, is it a little bit like, hurting viewers? I don't know. But to me, it's like, wow, how do you set the table that long?
Yeah.
But I think that's what we're trying to do,
Yeah.
like that, and it's also challenging.
I love St. Francis, and at the same time, it is the craziest thing to try to figure out what to do. Because it's exhausting, because there are a lot of ideas about how spirituality works, and unlike a lot of the churches, there's not always perfect agreement about how to do this thing, right? And so a lot of it comes down to permission giving. That I'm not going to try to make you have to do it a certain way. And you in reverse for me. And that's difficult because so much of religion has been about saying the right way up, the only truth, the correct manner of behaving.
I think that's why I'm here, is because when I was with evangelicals, it's like, you either believe what I believe, or you're gone. And here I can make a statement and say, well, I don't believe Jesus rose from the dead, or I don't believe Jesus was virgin birth, or these things. It's like, or I could even say, well, I question God. What do you mean by God? And nobody falls on the floor and goes, oh my God. It's like people were saying it's about paper.
Yeah.
It's about the mystery. And that's what it's like exploring things that are like, what is sacred? What is all the different wisdom texts, just let me bring it on.
But I gotta tell you, Judy, I don't mind when you question somebody else's deeply held beliefs. It's when you question mine.
Yeah.
but I think, so some of the places I see this, first of all, it's messy.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
don't like messy, we're probably
But
not,
life is messy.
yeah, it might not be the place for you. But I think it's like similarly as far to, you know, when I was a spiritual director, I had 4 clients who were atheists. My most beautiful sacred conversations were often with them. They happened to be scientists. And I just infused those conversations. And then, you know, all the way to the other end of the spectrum and like, how do we welcome someone who is more conservative and wants to be a part of this community? And that is a long table that I think we are trying right at this moment to do,
Figure out,
right? Like,
that's right.
I think it's a beautiful practice, but it's super, it's
Messy is a good word. I
Yeah,
just don't think-
can we have a table long enough that your conservative friends can sit at it?
And would they want to? though?
And would they want to?
But you know, it seems that there's, okay, so if you're talking about conservative folks. Basically, they're gonna go with this original sin thing, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay, then, I mean, that's just a bunch of garbage as far as I'm concerned.
I'm right there with you.
And, but if that's their foundational belief, right, because they were taught it, they believe it, whatever, that is that's like when they go deep inside, that's what they find,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So how do you serve as a church? How are you gonna serve? You know, I mean, don't you have to choose?
Not necessarily, not necessarily. I think you have to understand why that is important to them.
Okay,
And you may not ever accept that it's right or good for you, but if you can say, what is it that doctrine does for them? How does it move them? How does it motivate them? How does it change them? Then maybe you can live side by side, right? Even if you never can accept that, maybe, because you have a different conception of it. But it helps if that other person is also trying to do that about you too. If they're saying why it is that you hold this conception that doesn't make sense to them. So that at least you can know that the conception the other person has meaning, even if you don't need that meaning. Because the reason why I reject original sin is because I don't need for a baby to carry a curse. That doesn't move me. But if it's because there's something about us that needs to be healed and God provides the healing for that, I can see what they're doing, right? It's not an unsimilar process than me trying to find the deepest part of myself and living in that space. It's not what's helpful for me to get there, but it's not there's a book about different religions around the world. It's just marvelous. We studied it several years ago. And the author basically says, to know any religion, you have to say, what is the question they're trying to answer? And what do they see as the solution to it? And so the basic problem, as he framed it in Christianity, and I don't think that's true here at St. Francis, but in Christianity as a whole, the basic problem is sin. And so you need something that takes care of sin. Okay? In Islam, the basic problem is arrogance, and so you need submission to. You see, it's a whole different conception of how, and the same similar types of things might happen, but it frames how you do that differently. If that makes sense. I believe that at St. Francis, the thing is brokenness, and so you need something that brings you to wholeness.
why do you have to be broken? I mean, I don't feel broken.
Well, no,
I don't resonate with that at all.
well, but what I'm saying is that sometimes it's the brokenness of what the world around you has done to you. Not that you are broken, but that life has fractured you in some way or another. But all of us have to figure out that same type of thing. What is it that you see as how you're moving through life? Okay, and what are the things that are giving meaning and purpose and could change for you. Does that make sense? And you don't have to agree that the other person's thing is right or wrong. But if you can figure out what their motivation is, it helps you to at least be in conversation. The name of the book that just reminded me is called God Is Not One. It's a marvelous book. God Is Not One.
So we're not gonna get people on super conservative end here.
Right.
But we may get someone who is moving from their brokenness, looking for wholeness here. That has more evangelical roots, or just different roots than what we practice here. In fact, we have a lot of people who come here from those traditions. And so, just like, the human developmental level of all of the developmental levels, there's also a spiritual developmental level, and, people seeking healing or trying to come into their deeper knowing. The other thing is working with young people. I have seen this many times when children who've grown up in environments like St. Francis or the other churches that I've worked at will go off into a direction that I'm like, boy, Orthodox Jew, Orthodox Greek. I had one who became an Orthodox Greek Episcopalian. We've had kids become Mormon. And, my job in that situation and our job in the community is just to hold that space and go, wow, what are you getting from that? What are you learning from that? How is that changing your soul?
Yeah.
And most of the time that is a phase. But adults go through phases like that too. So anyway, that's kind of what it's.
Yeah, and part of it is however you frame the past. If I feel like I came from a broken family because of whatever, right? Then what I might seek is better relationship, good family. If I come from a strong family, that might not, because that's already a given in my life. And so I might see something else that is missing in that then that frames mine. And so it may look like I'm moving in an opposite direction as the person who's searching for a strong and whole family. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's because I've already got that which they're seeking, and so I'm missing something else.
This last thing I'll say about this, but I remember having this conversation right from the beginning with Jim, and it still affects me. And I still have to go back to this, that the phrase progressive Christian, right? And we own that, right? You go to the Progressive Christian website, we're listed. And there's an arrogance in that. They're setting us apart in that. And it's just a tricky area.
It's always a struggle to not think that the conception that you have that has worked so well for you, to not define it as the ultimate and only solution to.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
That's the reason I came here, even for the game group, if I happen to be atheist. But the people here are great, at least the people I have met here are really, in my opinion, really good people. So that's the reason I keep coming back. And then you mentioned the person that does the art group here. And I'm thinking I should get online and see what other things are going on around here, because it's a really good space. And the reason I came, because I knew this was very liberal and very progressive, coming from a Jewish background and being atheist now. So the word progressive has a very great connotation for me. But that's where I'm coming from.
Progressive
Yeah.
churches, and that's why I'm here.
And so we don't want to reject any of our labels, because those labels can be good. We also want to make sure that we don't, I think part of your point was, if I'm saying progressive and I'm the only one,
Or I'm better than
progressive
you,
or I'm better than you. And that's the hard part.
better than
though.
you, St. Mark's. or-
Because if I can look at you and in some way or another say the flow of spirit doesn't go through you, I think we're missing the whole point of John Scotus. Somewhere at the beginning of the chapter, it said something about that.
We did that with the label reconciling.
Yeah,
We
so
set
we're the
ourselves-
only.
Yeah, we set ourselves apart and puffed ourselves up.
Yeah.
That we were the first.
Yeah.
And
And nobody else can.
And lived on that for a long time.
Yeah.
To our detriment. I
Yeah.
think. But
it was what we had at the time, and we worked it.
That's right. That's right. So right at the beginning of the chapter, he starts off by saying, if somehow this sacred flow were dammed up or stopped, everything would cease to exist. This sacred flow is not simply a dimension of life that may or may not be there, depending on the moment, the place, the person, or the species. It is the very essence of everything that exists. So he's essentially saying, if I look and say, I have it all and you don't, no matter how right I am in my conception, I'm essentially saying that flow doesn't exist. Can that flow be there and they're just not feeling it or tapping into it or understanding it? And the better task would be, can I help them to figure out how to tap into that flow differently or better than what they are? Not necessarily to be like me, because that's what we do a lot. We try to turn everyone into me because Jim is perfect. But to somehow help them to figure out how to tap into that flow as well.
The flow is always there.
The flow is always there.
We just resist.
We do,
We have resistance.
we do.
Once you remove the resistance,
Yeah.
the flow flows.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
So-
there, it's in everyone, it's everywhere.
Yeah, and the hard part is that I can sometimes recognize easier how you're blocking the flow than how I'm blocking the flow.
I think usually that's a mirror, though, right?
Yeah,
I mean. you
Yeah,
see-
usually.
What you see in somebody else is probably what's actually going right on in you. you
sure.
know?
If we accept that that's true,
Yeah.
because it's the acceptance and the openness to that that is the difficult part, right? Augustine of Canterbury, I think, thought he was following an opening flow of spirit to the Celts. The Celts would say, how come you're blocking this flow of spirit that we've been feeling? We've been doing this really well for a while. Why are you coming in here and questioning?
Isn't that what we did here in this country? The American Indians, the indigenous groups,
We just
were
did.
willing to accept anything,
That's
they
right.
knew everything.
That's right. We just assumed that we had all truth, all knowledge.
I proclaim themselves.
Proclaim them savages.
Hmm.
Do you want to read a good book about that, by the way? 1491.
1619, I was just discussing with some of the
Yeah,
people
that's a
here.
good one as well.
Oh, that is fabulous.
But 1491 is purposely there because that's the year before Columbus comes. And it talks about all of the amazing civilization, all of the amazing patterns of thought and behavior that were happening here in the Americas before we came and Christianized. You know, before we came and fixed them. It's a really good, and it just is an eye-opening, heart-opening book that says, look at the incredible things that somebody that we wrote off as savages were and could continue to be if we would let them.
There's also a book called The Stammering Century. There's a- The Stammering Century, and that's what I talked about it with our group.
Yeah.
It's, I wanted to learn about the 1800s, because, I mean, you know, what happened in the 1800s besides the Civil War, you know, because that's all you think of the 1800s, 1860 to 1864.
Yeah.
There are other things that happened. The whole century was full of the same stuff that's going on now. Right. It was, I was so stunned. I was a book, I almost quit reading it, and I made myself finish it. It's ministers molesting little girls. The prohibition thing that came up later was just crazy then. There was like my way, you know, you can't drink, you can't do this, it was a.
Do you think that's all because of a lot of fear, people that hold the fear inside themselves, project it onto society, and therefore they don't want society having any part of it?
Yeah, and then information passed so much slower than too. And the whole dynamics was so different.
You were just talking about, a while ago, she brought up the fact that this church is known as under the label of being progressive. I, for one, think it's really good, especially from someone coming from the LGBT community, because so many churches have turned their backs on us. But that's one thing when I talk to friends, when I tell them I'm up here, it's the same phrase. St. Francis is known for how they accept everybody for who they are. And that's one thing that drew me to that, besides I was invited here, and it's been fantastic. the spiritual journey I'm on right now. But to be known as progressive, I think it's good because I don't know if you know that we have some that are supposed to be gay friendly. That's horse manure. No, they treat you like a second-class citizen in some of these gay-friendly churches, and I have not been treated like that at this church. I will tell you that. I was welcomed here with open arms. And I've got some very good friends here that I treasure. You know, but it's being progressive, I think is a good thing.
Sure.
That wasn't my point though, Sherry. My point was that we have to be careful that we don't get arrogant about it or that we think we're better than. And the term progressive has that
Is
connotation.
an implication.
There is an
Yeah.
implication in that.
So-
I don't think we are. I just,
Yeah.
It's,
So let me tell you what happened my first year or so that I was here at St. Francis. We had a conference down in Texas, right? Now, I grew up high school in Texas, conservative, you know, and this was just north of Beeville. In fact, on that trip, I went down to Beeville for a second, but
Yeah.
the thing was in the center of San Antonio. And San Antonio is a relatively conservative part of Texas, too. Travis Park United Methodist Church, right? Sits right in the center of San Antonio. The river walks a block away.
Mm.
Here's a church that's very open and affirming to the community, but is also not, is relatively conservative in its theology.
Mhm.
And can you be both of those? Well, St. Francis' definition is no. But there's an example of yes, you can. And I think we have to decide, do they go hand in hand, all the things that we put hand in hand, or is there a different or better definition out there? Wider and more diverse. What else can be true, I think is what, at least what the flow is asking us, because the flow is going through each of us. And it's more than what is defined inside of me. Or you, or even us. But it means we have to struggle with each other. And we have to help, I think, each other to be open. Because openness has not always been the hallmark of Christianity, has it? We've all met our Augustine of Canterbury that already had all the right answers, and these stupid Celts. Right? So what do we do in the midst of all this? How do we help each other?
This may be a big leap, but I was really struck about the phrase, pray until the tears come.
Yeah.
And it goes on and quotes Jung as when we read something in the sea, in the salt sea of life's origins is stirring in us again. And that just seemed to me like, you know, I try not to cry, but often it hits me anyway. And then tears can be a transformative part of the journey toward wholeness.
Where was that island or that place that they went where people would go there and then they would come later? That was there?
I own it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and John Philip Newell was I was gonna say Adams, that's the wrong word. Anyway, he was one of the higher ups of Iona. That's why he keeps mentioning that.
Is that in Ireland?
On the Scotland coast.
Yes.
How's it going?
Yes, and many people here have been there, right? Were you there?
You go on the. I'll go with you.
Field trip.
Yeah, there you go, Trip.
Well, that would be
And
challenging.
So let's think about that phrase, cry until you,
Till the tears come.
until the tears come. Pray until the tears come, when you can say that right. The hard part is that there's several reasons why tears might come. Might come because of sorrow. It might become because of a rush of a whole different other emotion. It could be this fascination of life that brings tears to your eyes, right? And as And is one better than the other? Is one set of tiers more honest than the other set of tiers? But they're very different, aren't they?
Could be some resistance, right?
That-
Just release whatever your particular resistance is, or whatever you've tapped into, the tiers release resistance
That's
to
exactly
the
right.
flow, right? I mean,
Yeah.
You're all dammed up. I think you even said something about that, that one line you read, that about being dammed up, or, resist the flow not flowing. If
Yeah,
you think of it as an individual, I mean, as a community, I think
yeah,
differently, but as an individual, tiers are absolutely
Yeah.
a release of resistance.
that's right. And if I'm trying to make you release in the way that I needed to release to allow my tears to come, I may not be helping you at all.
Yeah, but more, but it's explained on the 77. And, because that's what it starts about there, about pray until the tears come, but it says there that Iona teaches us that tears can cleanse our inner sight, washing the lens of the heart, that we might see clearly again the glistening of heaven and earth, and feel more deeply within us the currents of life's sorrows. Tears can be transformative part of the journeys toward wholeness.
But as he warns there, we have often in Western civilization
Yeah.
been told not to cry.
This,
To hold it back, to keep yourself.
Exactly.
this has been the biggest issue for me, because I am a crier because you feel emotion.
Yeah.
And when you cry, it is the completion of that
Release.
emotion. It's the completion. And when you stop yourself from crying, you're freezing that feeling. And it could be a good one, it could be a bad one. Usually they're the bad ones. And I mean, that is my whole memory of being laughed at every time I cried when I grew up.
Yeah.
And I grew up with brothers.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah.
And it was like, being laughed at. It really, this is like my trigger points,
Yeah.
because I feel like what we are so missing here is to have that depth of emotion, let ourselves feel, for goodness sake.
But that's
Release.
the undamming, right? And maybe I mean undamming in both its ways, right? The physical dam that we put up, the spiritual damning that we do to each other, right? The God doesn't love you type of damning,
Is that the shaming?
Yeah, that type of shaming,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
And both of those, I think, are huge retardants to what the spiritual life is about. And all of this, John Scotus Erugena, is about allowing that flow to be true and giving each other permission to do that, which is maybe why we need each other, so that we can, so that we feel in somebody else around us that which is encouraging us to get past however we have stopped our souls from moving, right? There's a lot more that we need to discuss on this, but our time is up.
Yeah.
All right?
Do you think you could continue this next week? Because I found this really relevant.
The good news is the other conversations continue to do this. Next week is about imagination, and it's about sitting in the same space, but you're right, we need to continue this type of conversation. Because how we've stopped each other through the ages, how we haven't allowed this to happen through the ages is essential to spiritual life.
Yeah, I found this more on a philosophical level.
Yeah,
That was pretty deep, and I just thought this would be great just to continue next week, or maybe for the next 20 weeks or whatever. to
Whatever.
flesh it out.
we
Huh?
We do continue on Sacred Flow tomorrow
yeah.
with
So,
me,
well,
and that's more about practice.
so I have the sheets of paper for the next chapter. I'll take into account, I'll try to decide if it's worth having more time on this chapter, think about it.
That's just my view.
Yeah.
I don't know how.
Yeah. The good news is that I don't want this to be the end of the discussion about this, because you're absolutely right. This is an essence of,
But just to forewarn of the book, these themes all run throughout each chapter. It's all about, aren't you feeling that kind of continuity And I think that's why he did leave out some women, by the way, there, yeah. Britt was not the only one, right? There were other women saints
women.
that he,
Yeah.
but because I think in some ways, getting this repetitive, like that had to be conscious on his part.
Sure.
That they're just repetitive patterns in each chapter.
So I do think that if we go back to the Roman Church, though, the Roman Church, one of the reasons why it shuts down things like this is because tears, emotion, straight things are difficult, right? And we need to keep having this kind of conversation. That's why women were not allowed positions of authority, because women deal in the areas where tears sometimes are encouraged.
Men are scared to death to cry.
We're scared to death.
Horrified. Not me, but
Absolutely. Absolutely.
you're taught that from day one.
Right?
That's all.
And that side that is closer to the emotions is essential for us, but we don't wanna face it. And that's why we codified these anti-emotion laws in religion. So
Will this be chapter 5?
we'll go to the next chapter, next time, but keep this in mind.
I thought the 4th chapter, though, you were skipping.
Oh, yeah, we're skipping the chapter on the Carmina.
So, yeah.
The Carmina is a songbook.
Oh,
the-
okay,
of the-
well, I had no
yes.
idea, okay.
So the chapter that we're doing next week is 5.
Yep, the chapter for next week is called Sacred Imagination, Alexander John Scott.
Okay.
So get a copy of it on your way out. All right, my friends, thank you for your time.
Hi, everyone.
Bye.
Yes, I
A lot
do.
of-
Wow.